Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you've topped up your caffeine levels, caught up on some of the networking, but there'll be more through the day, I've no doubt. So between now and lunch, we've got a great panel opposite, which has gone through some changes, so I'll let Paul, as the moderator, talk you through those as he kicks off. But I think what's exciting for me from the first panel, it touched upon a number of things we will revisit during the day in terms of what technologies, ESG, and what does diversity mean, where's the funding model going to come from, and these. So I'm delighted the next one's going to be looking at, what's the horizon scanning of what's going to change our lives going forwards. And then after this panel and before lunch, we have a debate around where would you put your life science company, either in the Golden Triangle or in Greater Boston area.
Easy call.
And why didn't you say that? And yet we did this poll publicly, and it was, a bit like the Brexit vote. It was pretty finely balanced.
Teasing.
Hopefully it won't be, both sides aren't one more damaging than the other. So without more from me, don't forget there is the Buy a News Round Award voting carrying on via the website and app, where you can vote for you think is deserving winner if you haven't voted already. The voting closes at 2. We'll announce the winner just at the end of the final session today. And I think that's probably it from me, so I'm going to hand over to Paul to take us through the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you. Can you all hear me at the back? Yeah, cool, excellent. We've had a bit of a rejig. In fact, we've had a major rejig in the last 30 minutes or so, because 2 of the panelists, unfortunately, can't be here. If I can go to the... of this group, Miguel, unfortunately, is stuck in Eurostar, which is broken down, and Christina's, her daughter's got COVID badly, and they're currently in hospital, so we have to give her some relief for that. But I've got, fortunately, I've managed to finagle 2 excellent replacements, one of whom, Rowan, is on another panel later, so she's getting a double hit of that.
I'm sorry, everyone.
Yeah.
But more networking time, potentially, who knows?
It's all I could find. And then Judith, who's actually one of my colleagues, but is equally well qualified as Christina in terms of her background experience in Big Pharma, etc. So without further ado, quick intros down the line, and then we'll go into the meat of this immediately. So, Rowan, please.
Hello, my name's Rowan Gardner. Today I'm going to be Miguel, and I'm sure you're going to be a lovely audience. I've been working in this space for more years than I'm going to admit, and it's just wonderful to see so many friends out there in the audience.
Hi, Laura Lane. Oh, that's loud. So I'm the Vice President of Venture Science for Eli Lilly. I head up the Lilly New Ventures team here in Europe, and background of business development, new co-formation, worked on the investor side. So really looking forward to the discussion with this panel today.
Hi, and I'm Judith Molnar, and I work with Paul at Transcript as a senior partner. My background, I'm a physician by training. I started off in academia in the US, then moved to large pharma, Pfizer and GSK later on. I worked with David when he was at the site head. Then moved to the biotech industry, and now at Transcript, and hopefully I can contribute to the discussion today.
Thank you. And last but not least.
And the least, yeah. Thank you, Paul. Nobbled by the chair in the first breath. David Roblin. I'm a physician, scientist, entrepreneur, I guess. My main role currently is Chief Executive Officer for a company called Relations Therapeutics. My career went back from the bed when I was a doctor to the bench when I was head of research at Pfizer. And the other notable thing I did was put the Francis Crick Institute up for Sir Paul Nurse, where I was Chief Operating Officer and remained Chair of Scientific Translation.
Thank you. And obviously eclectic. My background is also eclectic. I'm a pharmacologist, been in the industry for coming up 44 years, which tells me I need to retire. I'm also a senior partner in one of the formative group at Transcript, which, as you know, is a drug development organisation, da-di-da-di-da. So what we're going to talk about is what's coming over the horizon, both positive and negative. And the key elements is, what are the technologies, platforms, etc. Therapeutic modalities we can talk to, at least to a degree. We're not going to talk about cell and gene therapy in any great detail because that's what Miguel was going to talk about, and I don't think it was fair to dump that on Rowan at such short notice. But also the commercial, regulatory and clinical environment is changing markedly. COVID drove some of that, but there's also other disruptors in the sector that are coming through. We're going to talk about that. The corollary to that is all of these opportunities, fine and dandy, but what are the threats? Because there are an awful lot of them, a lot of headwinds, etc., etc. So I'm going to go this first question to a particular individual, get some comments from the others. If there are burning issues from the audience that need to be addressed then and there, fine. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the process. So I want these guys to highlight the key elements that they think are forming up that will shape the future. So David, so I'll start at the end, work my way backwards. Give us a sense of what's going on in early discovery and the preclinical space that floats your boat.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone, for being here. So I come at everything really as a physician ultimately, and so I like to think about the things that drive access to medicines, and one of the key issues, perhaps the key issue, remains something that over my 30 years in the industry we've made very little headway in, and that's the understanding of human biology. And I can say that because phase 2 attrition remains around 15, well, survival remains about 15%, around 20%. And that's little changed, really, over the 20 to 30 years that I've been involved. So when I'm looking for technologies that will create discoveries on the basis of which we can innovate, I'm particularly interested in those technologies that are giving us greater insight into human biology and the understanding of human health and disease. And fortunately, we're at a moment in time when we are beginning to get a huge degree of insight and resolution into what we'd call the central dogma of biology. DNA as it's transcribed to RNA, as it's translated to protein. And we now have new laboratory technologies that allow us to look at those 3 steps, particularly DNA and RNA, perhaps to a lesser extent protein in terms of specificity at the moment, at degrees of resolution and high density that has never been before possible. We're able to use whole genome sequencing, and that means now we can look at the whole genome, not just the protein coding genome. And remember that that part of the genome is around 97 to 98% of the actual genome. So it was fanciful for us to think that we'd sorted the DNA out once we understood the protein coding genome. So we're now beginning to understand what's happening in that genome that we used to call junk DNA, then dark DNA, and now we know there are a whole bunch of control mechanisms. And that part of the DNA is what makes me look different from Laura, look different from Paul, actually look different from a dog. This is important. We have the ability to see this now. The challenges are that through whole genome sequencing, through RNA transcriptomics, through proteomics, the data that we have is just extraordinarily large. There are literally lakes of data. And I think there's a Sidney Brenner quote. Sidney Brenner won the Nobel Prize in 2002. And one of his famous quotes in 2002 was, we are drowning in a sea of data, yet remain thirsty for knowledge. So the technologies are there. We're getting the right insights. What we need to now understand is how we can drive discoveries and innovations from those technologies that we have accessible. I'd like to go on and talk about machine learning later and the role of that with this high-density data sets. And I think also the other modality I'd like to point out in particular is our ability to use CRISPR and to CRISPR cells in the laboratory in order to try and recapitulate the phenotype of disease in those cells, and also to try and reverse the phenotype in those cells. So what this means, we can do a lot more earlier and a lot more earlier in human tissues, which I think is going to be really important to addressing where I started essentially, which is phase 2 attrition and the understanding of human biology.
Thanks, David. I mean, you've danced us through a huge amount there, and some of the other things that we're going to talk now will feed from that. But it is, we live in genuinely exciting times, but you know, getting from that to actually things which actually make a difference to people's, I'm not talking about lifespan. I think that's, you know, the 70 years and 10 and a bit is probably all we can hope for and be healthy. The other aspect is how could we keep people healthier longer so that when they do die, they die quickly rather than... yeah. And I genuinely, I'm serious about this because, you know, 15 years of slow death is awful. I'd rather literally fall off the peg tomorrow having, you know, done what I did.
It can be arranged.
Let's talk about living well to that point.
The thing is,
in time.
it's I'm closer to it than most of you in this room. Anyway, moving on. Actually, the sequelae, or coming from what David was saying about the genome and how we look at it differently, the corollary to that is something that Judith wants to talk about, which is the epigenetics element of the genome. So, give me a sense of that, and where you think the impact is going.
My favorite topic, or what I think is going to be really exciting, is epigenetics, and that's the machinery that controls gene transcription. And it has been around for a while, and I'm biased because I worked for GSK when over 10 years ago they set up, I think at that time, the first drug discovery group focusing purely on epigenetics, because I think it is really exciting to be able to turn on and off genes when you want to. And unfortunately, the progress hasn't been that great, but I think there's still huge potential. GSK's early success was in oncology, and it would be nice to see this outside of oncology. Think about autoimmune diseases when there's too much cytokine or something that you can turn on at a certain point in time. And why the progress was so slow, if the group was set up 10 years ago and lots of other people or companies joined the effort. One of the topic, I think, is the translation from animals to man and our lack of understanding the biology, just to follow up on David's point. And as we know more and more how the different epigenetic enzymes and the whole machinery works in animals, then obviously your predictions from, and my background is translational medicine, so how you predict from your animal model to man. And it's not just your efficacy, it's also your tox studies. What you see, is it going to really happen in man when you go to the clinic? Because there has been a gap in that sense, but I think it still has a huge potential in the future, and hopefully we'll see more and more drugs in that space.
Thank you, Judith. And you know, when you think about she and I were talking earlier about, you know, what triggers epigenetic changes and not necessarily internal. We could talk about what Epstein-Barr virus does to cells, which aren't necessarily changing the DNA, but changing how the DNA is actually worked down the line. Fascinating. We'll see where it goes. I'm going to change tack slightly with Laura, because Laura comes very much from the commercial end of the things. I mean, that's not to say she's not a senior scientist, serious senior scientist in her own right, but she's more oriented towards what these new modalities, etc., not just in terms of therapeutics, but also in terms of how we make these things impact the commercial space. So, Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can touch on that, Paul. So I'm not sure I'd ever claim to be an expert on anything, but I think one of the things I would say is that from a Lilly perspective, I mean, we're still very committed to small molecules and monoclonal antibodies. You know, established therapeutic modalities are still incredibly important. And, you know, we're seeing disease-modifying antibodies for, you know, large population conditions such as Alzheimer's. We're also seeing very impactful small molecule treatments in the area of obesity and diabetes. So, you know, we are making some progress in areas that have been typically pretty hard to move on. Obviously, along with sort of more established modalities, peptides, proteins, obviously also in the mix. But on the advanced modality side, We have looked a lot, and we have now collaborating and have done a number of partnerships and acquisitions in that sort of RNA space and gene editing and therapy space, both trying to do all kinds of things with RNA, whether it's down-regulating genes, up-regulating genes, correcting genes, and editing, and many flavors of RNA. I mean, we actually have a genetic medicines team out of Boston, which is their real core. So we're not forgetting established and modalities that we think and we strongly believe will have major impact for patients, but ultimately also looking at these newer, more advanced modalities. So I mean, it's all in the mix, and I guess once we've cracked human biology there, David, we'll be in a great position.
Thanks, Laura. I mean, she makes a point about COVID and the vaccines that we delivered in the later stages, namely Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech, really proved the case for RNA modulation. It showed that we could do something with that, make it work, make it safe, and do it very quickly indeed if we put our mind to it. Part of the issue with such therapeutics is the vectoring of change, and we're making major strides in that aspect of how do you get the RNA to where it needs to be and not where it doesn't need to be. And there's still some elements of that which float my boat particularly. So,
I mean, the one other thing I guess I would mention is that now we've got these advanced modalities. It really does come down to with the politician's answer, sort of delivery. So, looking at whether it's LMPs, whether it's viruses, whether it's all kinds of different ways to package things up so that they get to the place you want them to be, stay long enough, have the enable the mechanisms to do what you want them to do, where you want them to do them. It's completely crucial.
Absolutely. Not least, Rowan. Rowan wanted to talk a little bit about patient centricity. So again, slightly off piece from where we were going before, but equally important is that what's driving the new ways of developing drugs is to make it more focused on the patient rather than the concept. So roll it out, Rowan.
So David talked about understanding DNA at the level that they know the difference between humans and dogs, which worries me a bit because I might come over as a bit of a bitch at this point. But I think I'm incredibly excited about everything that David talked about. The resolution at which we can understand the processes going on in cells is just a treat. The younger members of the audience wouldn't understand, but when I was doing biochemistry, it was big buckets, right? You couldn't see a lot in a big bucket, but the resolution now is extraordinary. And, at Precision Life, we've been looking at learning to swim in these lakes of data for a long time and focusing on chronic disease. And I don't think it's enough to understand human biology. Right? We're not treating human biology, we're treating patient biology. And patients, when they present with chronic diseases, they will have multiple underlying etiologies that are the cause of their disease. And we're not treating cells, we're treating that whole person. And so I think, it's going to be really important to recognize the opportunity of looking at all of this data in the context of patients, because the opportunities that then reveals for both innovators and acquirers of new products and treatments are enormous. So just talking from Precision Life's experience, we've looked at 40 chronic diseases over the last couple of years. We've identified over 300 new targets through the lens of being able to stratify the patients and recognize that for many of the diagnostic labels that we have in the clinic, so that importance of, as David talked about, which we're all united over, we create value by making a difference to people's lives. In Alzheimer's, we see 6 different broad mechanisms all driving to Alzheimer's. Massive numbers of new targets for that disease. The same in ALS, MECFS. You can have a look on the website, there's loads of them. There's also the opportunity to recognise the value that pharma has in its clinical trial data. So we've been collecting many more data points in clinical trials, including genotyping and in some instances, genome sequences. And if, as we are working with large pharma companies to reanalyze their phase 3 data, one, yes, it can maybe improve and make more compelling the product as it comes forward to launch, because you know exactly what patient you're going to be targeting who will benefit from that medicine. But strategically, it's unlocking massive portfolio benefit in terms of your franchise strategy. Because if you have a disease where there are 5 broad mechanisms and you're bringing to market one new molecule that addresses one, you know exactly what other mechanisms you're going to go targeting in your BD conversation. And that's a really interesting piece of information asymmetry. Equally, working with the clinical trials organizations who are taking us through our products through the clinic, being more targeted, more patient-led in how we do our trials offers huge savings in clinical trial. As you come out of your clinical trials process, on launch, again, which patients you're targeting is going to be really important as you think about the consequences of value-based pricing. To be able to demonstrate benefit, to get the best possible reimbursement value for your new medicines. So I think that's what I'm really excited about is bringing patients to the forefront, and certainly, being able to do clinical trials, in the community. There's some really good innovation going on there.
Thanks, Rowan. I'm conscious of time in the sense that we're halfway through and we've just really touched the surface here. But that is our starting point. There are so many strands to this that it's incredibly difficult to necessarily to mesh them all together. But I want to do a little bit of a deep dive. If we can keep it brief as well, please, that would be great, because I do want to get onto the threats. David, you talked about humanization. Now, there's 2 ways of looking at humanization: personalization, and how do we humanize things that are currently animals that we're trying to get into a human variant. So what does it mean, David?
Yeah, I mean, they were important. I mean, in some ways, it's an obvious statement to say that you should base your biological rationale of the targets and pathways you explore based on human data. I mean, it was done too infrequently, actually, and there are analyses that were published from GSK, Pfizer, and AZ that looked at portfolios and assessed the portfolio entries based on whether they had evidence of human biology through genetics or some other fashion. And what they showed in retrospective analyses is that those targets and pathways and candidates that had human competence were much more likely to survive. In fact, nearly double. I think the Pfizer number was 1.6, the AZ number was 1.8. I don't remember the GSK number. So it's always struck me, and it did in Pfizer, because I created a genetics unit in Pfizer over a decade ago, that we should be probing biology as deeply as we can using human cells and tissues. So that's at the root of everything I try and do now. I try and avoid using animals and using animal cells because, and actually what I ideally want to use are primary human tissues and cells, so cells that are taken from a patient with disease, because I'm nervous about any move from that. Now, that's the challenge. You can't always succeed, but you need to work damn hard to try and make sure you work in primary cell tissues, or understand the degrees of risk that you're taking as you move away from that central driver. I think all of this, all of the roads here lead to better understanding of disease, more, so I think we'll have more success in R&D. We'll carry less failed targets further. And that will transform our industry, by the way. A very small change in phase 2 survival, for example, will have extraordinary impact on the valuation of the portfolios. So I'm kind of really optimistic. We need to talk in this panel about how we interrogate the seas of data, because I think that's what's been lacking. The data's been with us for the last sort of 5 years, really, and the ability to do single-cell analysis through transcriptomics and genomics is now commonplace. And it's how we use that data, I think, is the next big question.
Thanks, David. I just have this vision in my head of we used to move to mini pigs. Are we going to be moving to mini humans down the line? But that's just an aberration thought. The data and the volume of data, which you alluded to, David, is and I'm not going to talk about artificial intelligence because I think that's stupid. But machine learning is a case. Seriously, because how do you define it? But machine learning is a thing. It's the new elephant in the room, and Judith wanted to talk a little bit about that because that's her thing. So what's the promise, and what does it mean, and how can we use that explosion in a meaningful way?
I think the future is bright for machine learning, and machine learning is basically when a computer behaves as man or as people, and there are two main types. One is when you feed data to the machine. For example, you tell the machine in image analysis that this is how a broken bone looks like, and then the machine can diagnose certain diseases. The other one is the unsupervised type machine learning, when the computer does it by itself. So it looks for features in the data, and it can be huge amount of data, as David was saying, that we have maybe in vitro, I don't know, cell activation data, you have genetics data, you have histopathology data, or if you think about clinical trials, who is responding to your treatment, and you let the machine work its way through and find features that the human eye wouldn't, or associations wouldn't. So it's not just clinical trial data, it's in drug discovery. It can speed up the process, and there are drugs in the clinic that were designed by machine learning. So it started off in chemistry, basically, and then people looking at their in vitro data and try to combine in an unbiased way and try to find associations and speed up discovery. But there are some questions around this, that is it really biased if you tell the machine what to look for? Is it as accurate as man? If the machine is doing really mundane tasks, that's really good, because then the physicians or the human effort can be put somewhere else. One of the issues with clinical trials and identifying patients who respond to your therapy, if it's not a logical mode of action or something that really relates to the already known mechanism of the disease, will the regulators approve a drug that's based on a software identifying that if you have, I don't know, this much glucose level and that on your image analysis, that group of patients respond to this treatment, but we don't really understand the biology yet to put it together. Is it going to be approved? So I think regulators sort of moving with machine learning a little bit, because the software goes under, and I'm not a regulatory expert, I just saw the medical device category. So if you use a software for your discovery or your image analysis mainly, then you need to go down that path. But yeah, coming back to this, that is a drug going to be purely approved on this. And I had, the third one was the bias. Yeah, I already touched upon that. So I think the future is bright, but there are some issues. I don't know whether you want to add anything.
Yeah, just rather quickly. I mean, I think that's a really important perspective. So what machines will do is give us correlations, right? They look at these seas of data and say, well, this thing moves when that thing moves. And I think I would caution the audience that you need to think very carefully about the biological systems where you can test those correlations and findings. So I think very deeply about what I call lab in the loop. So the machine learning will give us the correlations. It can actually identify genes that it thinks are associated with disease quite easily. And there are important papers that were published by DeepMind and Informa is the model. But what's key here is where can you take that quickly into reliable single-cell assay where you can see ground truth. And you can read something in that cellular assay, and this is where I think the single-cell technologies are really important in this lab in the loop, because then if you can achieve ground truth, you can create a circle of active learning where the machine, through an unsupervised way, can make recommendations. The laboratory can do the experiments and feed back that information to the machine.
I think you
very, very quickly. And what this is about, right, is crushing cycle times to getting increasing confidence around biological pathways and therefore targets and candidates.
I think you've hit a point there, David. As you say, it's about crushing cycle times. It's not an end-all goal in its own right. It can't give you answers. It can only give you directions to further investigation. Unfortunately, there has to be a human in the loop that actually makes sense of it all somewhere along the line. We are a bit constrained for time, but I do want to talk it's slightly tangentially again, because ultimately we have to sell these products to people, and the commercial landscape is changing, and Laura wants to talk about that. And then finally, I'm going to get Rowan to talk a little bit more about what she was talking about in terms of patient-driven development and the impact on decentralized studies, and then we're going to go to threats.
I think I would also just, that's all good. I'm just going to go back to that other question. So, I mean, the point about faster cycles totally get you. I think the other thing, of course, is that, you know, it's actually faster first in human to approval. I mean, you're both doctors, I'm not. Like, that's the thing we really care about here. And working hard to actually be able to reduce that. And just, you know, actually, we have been working really hard to really power that R&D engine to be able to do that. And if you look back at the data, our own internal data of, like, you know, 2010 to 2014, it was taking just under 12 years to get from first in human to approval. And now that number's down at below 6, just 5.9 years. So, yeah, okay, we've had, you know, some products that, you know, have worked well for us, but that's not without an enormous amount of, you know, talent, effort, but also, I think, using all the tools that are at our disposal, whether that's, you know, partners and, you know, regulatory interactions, but also it's about using new computational methods. It's trying to, you know, pick the right patients. It's trying to do all those different things. So I think, you know, it's not just in the discovery stage, it's all the way through to the clinical stage as well. I suppose the other thing that, to go back to your question, Paul, didn't ignore it completely,
No.
I think is...
They usually do.
Yeah. Is also just sort of bringing us to some of the sort of, I guess, commercial landscape changes that are kind of on the horizon and perhaps kind of close on the horizon. So, you know, we're getting a lot of questions around, you know, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Acts in the US and kind of what that means for the commercial environment. You know, we don't 100% know yet in a sense, but essentially for those of you not familiar, it's really around CMS taking the top 10 small molecule drugs, most likely negotiating on those, and then every year doing another 10. And so obviously we're not, you know, people aren't entirely sure how this is going to play out yet. Actually, this may favor biologics. Maybe this means that pharma needs to have more partners, work with more biotechs to kind of bring more assets in, or maybe this you know, means that small molecule innovation is stifled. I mean, we don't actually know yet. So I think that's one of the things that, from a commercial landscape, is, you know, is going to be changing things. I think closer to home here in the UK, many of you may be aware of the VPAS changes around sort of what's termed voluntary pricing and access scheme, and again, making it potentially harder to, or harder to potentially launch products here, not because it's, but because it's not a commercial market you would go to. Now, given that we have such strength in science here, we have translational we have translational expertise. The UK has always been this place that attracted top scientific talent, and we're very proud of that legacy that we have here in the UK. But to have changes that are going on that may make the UK less attractive than our European peers, where we've always been up there, I think is also it's challenging. So we're also just working through that as well. So lots of things to kind of chew on, and that's kind of before we've got to, I guess, the funding environment at the moment. And while there is plenty of dry powder, I think there's 40 billion of cash that was raised in the last 18 months by venture funds, and many of those are in there's quite a lot in Europe as well. It's not going to be the same as it has been the last 2-3 years. So I think we're also going to be grappling with that at the same time as well.
Thank you.
I'm going to skip my bit because I want to get on to opportunities, but I'm going to say I'm back on the panel at 1:30 with Lisa, and I'll talk about the machine learning piece and why I think there's a lot more that we need to be doing than just what the limitations are on that. But let's talk about opportunities.
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about threats. as
Okay.
well.
They're the same thing.
We are very,
Yeah.
very prepared.
In
Exactly.
every threat, there's an opportunity.
We can't just do threats, we
Totally
have to do
reverse.
opportunities.
And if you don't shut up, I'm going to threaten you. Anyway, sorry.
There's a reason they made me sit next to him.
Holistically, I think we've already discussed is the subject of probably 3 or 4 other seminars, because we've only really touched the surface. But I do want to get to what the threats of what we're doing and trying to do come in. And I'm going to start off by mentioning what worries me. Infectious disease worries me. COVID, new pathogens, and the demographics of disease are changing markedly. The impact of global warming, the fact that we now have Zika virus endemic in southern Florida because the mosquitoes are moving north because it's getting warmer, migration of populations, that's a completely different ballpark. And the converse is we're exporting first world diseases to the third world, obesity, diabetes, all the rest of that. This is stuff that's going to be flowing over us big time, and we need to be prepared for that. But Laura, you have some specific worries about...
Well, I think I just mentioned a lot of them. I think the changing frameworks from a commercial perspective is something obviously that, got to bear in mind. The funding environment is one thing. We aren't in a situation where, at the end of, 2008-9, the financial crisis then, there's a lot, we have a much more mature biotech ecosystem and funding environment here than we did then. So, this isn't an adolescent environment in any way, shape or form. Like, we've kind of grown up. So, and we've also got, funds around us that also have capital and will still be deploying it. But equally, it has to be a concern about attracting top talent, attracting, young scientists, postdoctoral researchers that go to, great universities here in the UK that also then are, the foundation scientists within the biotech and life science and pharma ecosystems that are basically, are super important because, where are we going to be in 10, 15 years' time? We've just put up some barriers around, making this, I guess, the place of choice. And so, and to then also add, I think, into, it's not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but of course it's just inflation, and what that means from a cost perspective to running anything, and also the unpredictability there. We talked about advanced modalities, often takes a lot of manufacturing, effort and energy to do that. Energy costs, I know everyone's probably, very aware of it from just day-to-day living, but equally, when you're running plants and you're running manufacturing outfits, that's going to affect CROs, it's going to affect manufacturing, it's going to affect, the ability to produce these products in the way that we've kind of just sort of become used to. So those are some things that I guess definitely kind of are a concern.
I can add to that, something that we never think about in our industry is the fact that the data processing of the vast amounts of data that we have has an environmental impact. in terms of the energy, the number of computers, and the churning through the cloud systems. There's an estimation by 2030, 25% of total world generative power is going to be on servers. I mean, that's frightening. That amount of energy is required to run a little spinning disk so we can churn our data with. So, Rowan, your bugbears. You were talking about patient benefit thinking.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, you rightly touched on chronic and infectious disease. I also sit on the board of Digital Health and Care Wales, which is the Welsh NHS body looking at digital health and these issues. And absolutely, we do worry about energy costs for our data centres and all of that. But I think, we have an ageing population. We have huge societal chronic disease burden. I think what we heard this morning was there's a huge general risk-off mindset at the moment. The world feels like a frightening place. In that situation, people like to cling on to cash rather than invest it. And I think we heard Charles say, we'd prefer to put our money into big pharma because they've always been, safe harbours at some shop. We have been looking at this patent cliff, getting ever closer for several years now. And it could be that the innovations that we're talking about and that we're all very excited about just won't deliver revenue for pharma on that time frame. And so, I think one of the threats, which is also an opportunity because they all are, is pharma maybe taking the view that they should be using all of this data to find additional revenue opportunities in their existing IP. And so drug repurposing and indication extension on patent medicines, is phenomenally interesting. And again, Precision Life's experience, we've got 250 indication extension opportunities in the 40 chronic disease areas that we've studied. I can tell you on every call we have with a prospective customer, we dance through, would you like to understand disease biology better? Yes, for all the reasons that David outlined earlier. Oh, would you like new targets, or are you interested in repurposing opportunities? And the pendulum is very much more on repurposing opportunities. And that isn't necessarily good news for the majority of people in this room looking for people to take innovation in the near term. In the longer term, I think yes, but in the near term, it's more challenging.
So are you saying that we talk about the valley of death is going to get wider potentially in the short term?
It's going to get scarier.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I mean, wider, deeper, frostier. It's going to need us all to think more imaginatively about the totality of what we're doing. Equally, as I said, if you've got a product in the clinic right now, and we can help you find a second indication for the product, that's enterprise value right there in terms of an M&A discussion. So I think that's something that is a bit uncomfortable that we need to give some thought to as a sector.
How many minutes have we got? 5 minutes. Okay. So I don't want people to shut up. I take your comment, and then I'm going to ask for Q&A.
Okay, I think I would just add is that, at Lilly, early stage innovation, first in class, things that are new are still really interesting. So yes, okay, we look at later stage, like a lot of pharma, I think we're waiting for some later stage opportunities. There is money in the coffers for big pharma. There's plenty been written about that by SVB or Morgan Stanley and everybody else. But equally, that you can't ever just neglect one part of what you're doing. So, that's why we have a ventures team. That's why we have, why we invest in, we invest in venture funds. We invest in many early stage companies in order to try and make sure that, what is perhaps on the fringe for us right now, at some point once data is there and progress is being made, that you actually then can bring that into the core as well. So, I think
Laura's
that's super
open for business, guys.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So if you see dollar signs above her head, you know why. David, you wanted to make a comment.
Well, yeah, just like, it's always been thus, right? I mean, I lived through the Pfizer Lipitor patent expiration, and there will always be patent expirations. As long as our industry is successful, there will be patents in about 10 years' time that we lose. So I have to be optimistic, right? Because the ability to do science, do it quickly, do it more accurately, has never been greater in my lifetime. So I am optimistic. I like to think about health span and not disease span. So that's particularly, how do we ensure that people live longer, better? There's despite the fact our industry has transformed lifespan, the reality is that if you're 65, you've got an 80% chance of having a chronic illness. And if you've got one chronic illness, you've got a 70% chance of having another. So there's a huge opportunity to deliver improvements to productivity based on that. I mean, I think in the US, I think I've seen that estimated as like $3.7 trillion. You're not going to sort it all out, but that is 20% of lost GDP.
Sure.
So there is a cyclical argument that one can't avoid and we shouldn't avoid. And I also think that actually venture investment into Europe is much more sophisticated. If people look at my investors, they're all West Coast, and they're all opening London offices. They see an opportunity in the science, and they're coming this way. So I think there remains a good opportunity, and it's based on the science that we're seeing. So let's be optimistic in the whole.
Yeah.
Thank you. On a personal note, I'm 69, so where does that leave me in terms of my risk factors?
20% or 80%.
Exactly. Right, any questions?
So one topic which crops up, I suppose, a lot would be the whole area of obesity. And I suppose we're talking about treating obesity versus maybe the elephant in the room is policy.
Literally.
Is food consumption, processed foods, too much food, too many calories. What is the panel's, I suppose, perspective and thought of trying to address that elephant in the room, which is a huge elephant given all the political, food industry, etc. Any thoughts on that particular topic?
So please, we're thinking of the elephant in the room as being large rather than obese, just to be clear.
I can.
I'm happy. Well, we've probably both got an angle on it. First, I'll say it's great because it's a big market, right? So a big market can stand lots of different solutions. And clearly, if you're in a healthcare organisation, social or insured, you are very minded to pursue interventions that either, keep people healthy for longer, or maintain people in, so I'm thinking about diabetes, maintain them in a position where they're managing their diabetes well, rather than, inflict the 80% of the costs that are associated with managing the side effects. I think the biggest issue in terms of the lifestyle changes, the encouraging people to be healthier, is I've yet to see a healthcare system that can measure the cost of not doing something. Right? I think for me it's the financial models. So I see things which we're doing really important innovations in the NHS right now, being justified by the time saving of a doctor being able to sign a prescription digitally rather than a wet signature. But that then completely ignores all of the patient benefits that come from those investments. And because they're not cash saving or can be accounted for, right? It's very hard to get the healthcare system behind that innovation,
Yeah.
whereas we know how to buy drugs.
Yeah.
And I think that's the tension.
So death by bean counting. Judith.
Can I?
Sorry.
Oh, go on.
I was just going to answer a question about the policy. I think that's what you were asking. And I went to a talk by Chris Whitty a few weeks ago. And generally, how society approaches limitations, like we know the negative effect of smoking. So there's policy that you cannot smoke. And people about obesity, they don't want that. So there's a lot of, we know it's really simple, isn't it? You need to eat less and you need to exercise more. So technically, it's really, really simple. But in terms of policy, the society or people they don't want to see the calorie content on the menu.
They still eat it.
It is going to be difficult to, and I don't think we are going to see that regulation that eat less, move more.
So last,
Okay.
Laura,
I
because
mean, I'm hesitant to talk about this. I can see a diabetes obesity colleague, Birgit, who's at the back, hello, who could answer this probably with much more a problem than I could. But I mean, it's not super simple. It's super complicated, actually. And, these are, obesity is one example, is underlying a lot of other disease conditions, and it's a disease in its own right. We are treating patients here, and I think that's something we should remember, whether that, whether we talk about mental health or whether we talk about obesity or whether we talk about cancer, we are treating patients here with an underlying condition. And, you can't always solve these things on your own. I mean, perhaps you'd like to, but actually that's, you go and see a doctor when you've hurt your leg. So actually, if you can't keep your weight managed and under control for whatever reason, then that is also something to seek help about. And I think, if we can actually, rise to that challenge, and I think, certainly at Lilly, diabetes has been important to Lilly for 100 years. Actually, our first external partnership was on insulin, and obviously it's something that's incredibly close to where we are. But that has now moved on to the obesity area as well. And actually, if we can address and we can reduce weight loss by 20%, which is what we are seeing by products, by products and such like that, actually that should make a massive impact for patients with not just obesity, but with diabetes, with cardiovascular comorbidities and such like.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
patients in real life and the social determinants of health, I think, are also something that are very complex.
I also think
Thank
that was a miserable question. This is the season of excess.
Yeah,
I think there's
exactly.
mince pies outside, right?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. We don't have any time for any more questions. I was just thinking about Lilly as a lean, mean fighting machine, thinking about obesity for the last 100 years, but I'm not saying anything. Thank you, guys, very much. It's been eclectic. We've danced through a lot of things. We still have a lot of questions, and I think, from my perspective, I would love to follow this up with further events which are much more focused on one aspect or another. Tony, I've kept you just about on time.